theory education is fundamentally flawed. Its obsession with analysis has instilled a cultural perspective to objectivity itself, and as a result, academic research remains Eurocentric and lacks diversity. The disregard of cultural influence in the name of objectivity has blinded academics, keeping them from realizing their own biases and stunting the growth of musicianship worldwide. I have no clue if that made any sense at all to y'all, but you have to admit, it sounded very, very impressive. One of the most well-known music theory courses in the USA is the AP of Music Theory and Composition exam. This exam tests many things, from sight singing, harmonic and melodic dictation, voice leading, cadences, progressions, etc., etc. Like any other AP exam, there's a lot of material. However, when you look at all this material, you'll notice that it's a very Eurocentric and outdated set of skills. You're not going to find any music from this century on the exam. You won't find any music from Asia or Africa. You'll find very, very classical harmonies, melodies, and rhythms straight out of Beethoven or Mozart. And the reason behind this is very, very simple. College Board says so. College Board is the organization that administers and designs these AP exams, along with the SAT, ACT, PSAT, and a whole slew of other exams and tests and courses, etc. For AP Music Theory, College Board basically said, this is an introduction to the way classical European composers made music. We will not be learning anything else in this course. We decided that this is what you need to know, and so that is what will be taught. Let's try something. I'm going to say a name. Let's see if you've heard of that person. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, Brahms. Most of y'all have heard of all of these names. Most of y'all have heard of most of these names. And it makes sense why we study these composers in AP music theory, even if they aren't relevant. They clearly wrote the best, most intellectual, most impressive, most technical, most powerful music, right? They clearly have the superior music. They are individuals of genius who rise above the masses and their music. This brings me to my first point. Remember the names of all those composers? Some of you might have realized that all of them were German composers. These German composers who wrote better music than, say, American composers, who had a superior culture, who were individuals of genius, unlike our American composers. And as a result, these Germans had a better music taste than our uncultured, uncouth, unrefined taste. This is why American music theory education was not built around American music, but rather European music, specifically German music, right? This brings me to my next point. Language is often used as a metaphor or analogy for music, which is true to some extent. Just like every culture has their own language, every culture has their own music tradition. And just like every language has their own grammatical rules and quirks, every music tradition has its own music theory. For example, I'm going to stick with the tradition that I'm most familiar with, which is South Indian Carnatic classical music. Carnatic classical music has many similarities to Western music. For example, the concept of swara, which is similar to the concept of tone or pitch. You can see here, even though Carnatic musicians and Western musicians call notes by different names, it's still the same notes, with the same distances between the notes, the same frequencies, and, at the end of the day, it's the same musical system. And, there's a similar idea with other concepts. For example, melakarta, which is similar to the Western idea of key. Well, the significant difference is that there are a lot more scales in Carnatic classical music, but that's due to other, non-musical, reasons, like, time of day and stuff like that. There are a lot of other parallels between the two, and as a result, it's possible to describe different aspects of music using each other's music theory. So in the same way that you could just understand another language by listening for familiar sounding words in your own language. For example, in Western tradition, you would describe this scale as a C double harmonic scale. However, we could also call this Maya Malavagala Raga, in accordance with Carnatic music tradition. They're the same thing, just named two different things by two different cultures. However, there are dozens of concepts in Indian classical music that an average Western classical musician would struggle to grasp, such as the intense ornamentation and thousands of scales. These are just the most basic 72. Similarly, an average Carnatic classical musician might be unfamiliar with Shankarian voice leading, as seen on the right. So maybe instead of looking at 50 examples by Bach and Beethoven, we look at a dozen each, and then a couple dozen from Indian classical music, and then maybe a couple dozen from Arab maqams and some Indonesian gamelan music, There's some music from African traditions, or South American traditions, or Pacific Islander traditions, instead of just purely European music traditions, right? Maybe that would help, further modern day music educations, because musicians as a whole would be more well-rounded, being able to grasp both the intensely virtuosic ornamentation of Indian classical music, along with the pleasing constant quality of tonal Western harmony. And music, they would be significantly more educated, they'd have more tools for their music to create and perform better and more difficult music. However, today, most musicians are only educated in one of these styles, so they lack a complete understanding of music. But why is this the case? Music is supposed to be somewhat universal, right? It should be able to transcend cultural boundaries. After all, everyone enjoys music. To see what's wrong with this perspective, let's attempt to objectively determine music's legitimacy as a cross-cultural music communication. Basically, is music universal? And I'd say no. And here's why. Different cultures value different things in music. And as a result, we might not even agree on what music is. Imagine if we all learned West African music theory. You would not be considered a musician unless you could dance. And while it seems a little bit ridiculous, for a West African musician, dance is necessary to understand the layered metric styles of many African rhythms, and can help with performance. This means that we cannot separate the culture of music from the analysis of music. This desire for a separation of analysis from culture in music theory is a massive flaw in academia, which sounds strange. We don't want our analysis to contain cultural perspective. It needs to be objective, right? And since when is objectivity biased in terms of culture? And this is what brings us to the crux of the issue. Let's go back to Pythagoras. Pythagoras is widely hailed as in popular culture as the father of both music and math. In medieval Europe, music was taught alongside math, astronomy, and geometry. Math supposed to be number, music meaning number in space, astronomy meaning number in both space and time, and we could basically say that Pythagoras was the first attempt at objectifying musical analysis. But this would not be the last attempt to analyze music objectively. In the early 20th century, a man named Heinrich Schenker attempted to do just this. His method of analysis was known as Shankarian Analysis, and it is still taught in colleges today. In terms of analysis, it is actually an incredibly useful tool. And it also looks really, really impressive. Like, look at all these lines and numbers and symbols. Like, it's crazy. Like, put that up, you see that someone's paper and you think they're a genius, okay? They are smart, okay? They know what they're doing, right? However, Schenker was supposedly, this is a little bit difficult to determine because historically it's hard to find accurate sources on this, was supposedly a bit of a Nazi. And the Nazis would use Shankarian analysis to quote-unquote objectively prove that music is good and music is bad. Schenker essentially said that when a piece is dissected with Shankarian analysis, the easier it is to simplify the piece to fit a certain arbitrary chord progression, the better that music was. He basically evaluated the greatness of composers using this music and made a list of the greatest composers. The list of composers was very German. And he decided to arbitrarily take this form of quote-unquote objective analysis to evaluate musical genius. And him being who he was, he decided that the greatest and most ingenious composers of all time should all be German. Let's see how many of these composers you have heard of. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, and Brahms. Sound familiar? This idea of using Western classical theory to explain the genius of someone's work is still found today. Music theory is portrayed as a sort of hidden knowledge used to identify genius. But the fact is that even the most objective music analysis is a manifestation of a certain cultural perspective. Classical music is from that Eurocentric white cultural and racial perspective. Indian classical music is from an Indian cultural perspective. West African music theory is from a West African perspective, etc., etc., etc. Modern music theory will always have a cultural perspective because you cannot separate music from culture without completely missing the point. Objectivity is impossible when you are dealing with music. There will always be a cultural perspective with music, and modern music education in academia still hasn't understood that. Academia still clings to the Eurocentric white racial perspective of music. Education follows, musicianship falls. So where do we go from here? It is quite apparent that modern-day American music theory is very Eurocentric, but music theory will never be able to separate the musical aspect of music from the cultural aspect. So as long as we analyze only American music, is it really a problem? Well, yeah. But no. It is important that we recognize this inherent flaw in musical analysis and that we have no choice but to accept it. But that doesn't mean that we can just educate ourselves in one form of musical or cultural analysis. Imagine if linguists only studied English, or if all soccer was played in Brazil. It's a massive violation of the globality of music, and it needs to change. However, change has been difficult. Academia generally dislikes change, and this is no exception. But we find that the arguments against the globalization of music theory vary in credibility, with some quoting Wikipedia and others raising genuine questions to the feasibility of teaching multiple perspectives on cultural and music theory at the same time at a high level. But at the end of the day, even if academia is not convinced, I hope that musicians and composers themselves are. The vast scope of musical diversity across the world isn't being utilized to the full extent in modern day music, and the vast amount of musical knowledge that cannot be found by studying Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms, etc., is heavily underutilized, when it could inspire a massive paradigm shift in music as we know it. Thank you.